Rishal walked through the scanning chamber with the confidence of someone who'd already won a game nobody else knew they were playing. The white-blue overhead lights hummed their antiseptic song, while holographic displays flickered with security protocols that had apparently been written by someone who'd never actually encountered a human before. Her silver-gray cadet uniform fit perfectly. Her dark blonde hair was secured in a practical low bun. She looked like the exact kind of person you'd trust to follow the rules. Kreks stood at the security terminal with his burgundy Catanese exoskeleton catching the harsh light. The crustacean's forward-facing amber eyes tracked the scanner readout as Rishal stepped onto the platform. His mandibles relaxed into what might have been called a welcoming expression, if mandibles could do that. Two hands rested on the control panel with practiced precision. Standard disarm protocol applies to all cadets, Kreks said without looking up from his display. Weapons rack is directly to your left. Handheld devices in the bin. Anything blade length or longer must be logged and stored. Of course, Rishal said and smiled warmly. The kind of smile that made it impossible to imagine she was thinking about the throwing stars in her hairpins or the knife blade folded into the seam of a uniform collar. She stepped out of the scanner as if she'd just been completely transparent to its senses, which she had been because the scanner was useless. Thalassa emerged from the observation room with the fluid grace of someone whose entire evolutionary history involved moving through water. Her iridescent scales caught the light in shades of deep ocean teal and silver white. The gill fronds along her jawline folded gently as she approached with a tablet. Her luminous turquoise eyes with their vertical elliptical pupils examined Rishal with the kind of focus that suggested she was noticing things. Cadet Rishal, Thalassa said smoothly. New to the academy. Transfer from the Eastern Command Base. 3 weeks in. Rishal confirmed, settling in well. Everyone here is incredibly professional. Kreks's exoskeleton brightened slightly to burgundy rose. The compliment worked on him. He started typing something into the terminal without really paying attention anymore. The scanner behind Rishal had already registered her as cleared. The weapons detection array had registered nothing because the weapons detection array was fundamentally confused about what it was supposed to be detecting. Thalassa's gill fronds fluttered slightly. Just a tiny movement. The kind of movement that meant she wasn't entirely satisfied with the explanation, but couldn't actually identify what was wrong. Her bioluminescent shimmer along her collarbone pulsed gently like it was reading her own uncertainty. She tilted her head and studied Rishal's uniform with the intensity of someone who was missing something obvious. You seem very calm, Thalassa observed. Most cadets show elevated stress responses during disarm protocol. Rishal's face remained open and friendly. This was the part where she had to lean into her own confidence without showing it. I grew up around weapon management. It's not stressful for me. It's just procedure. Your background check mentioned private security training, Thalassa said, and her gill fronds extended slightly more, not in anger or fear, but in something closer to suspicion. You were weapons certified at age 18. Residential estate security is mostly about presence and protocol, Rishal said smoothly. Actual weapon use was minimal. Mostly training and drills. Kreks glanced up from his terminal and his mandibles clicked softly. Background checks are comprehensive. If she cleared, we cleared her. His exoskeleton was already shifting back to its normal burgundy. The conversation was becoming administrative and therefore boring, and his attention was already drifting toward the next cadet scheduled for screening. Thalassa's gill fronds folded against her neck, but they didn't fully relax. She looked at the scanner readout and then back at Rishal and then back at the readout. The data was clear. Nothing registered as a weapon. The scanner said she was clean, except something in Thalassa's aquatic instincts was pinging like a sonar alarm that shouldn't be ignored. But she had no evidence. She had nothing but a feeling, and feelings didn't override the technology that Kreks had configured himself. Proceed to barracks assignment, Thalassa said finally. Inspector Sylvanus will conduct standard quarters orientation in 30 minutes. Rishal gathered her empty weapons bin and walked toward the corridor exit with perfect military posture. Behind her, Kreks was already pulling up the next cadet's file, and Thalassa's gill fronds were slowly retracting back toward her neck as she convinced herself that nothing was wrong. The academy corridor was all geometric architecture and soft ambient lighting that somehow managed to feel both welcoming and sterile. Aiden was waiting by the barracks entrance with his dark brown hair slightly tousled and his hands clasped in front of him like he was trying Clear's throat. Very hard not to fidget. His forest green eyes widened slightly when he saw Rishal emerge from the security section. "You're done," he said, and something in his voice suggested he'd been genuinely uncertain about this outcome. "I was starting to think we'd hear some kind of alarm. What kind of alarm would that be?" Rishal asked and walked past him toward the barracks corridor. "I disarmed completely as required." "You absolutely did not," Aiden said and fell into step beside her. His muscular frame made the corridor feel smaller somehow. "You have at least 15 weapons on you right now, and I can only see 2 of them, and I'm specifically looking." 16, Rishal corrected absently. "And you can see one. The blade in my left boot is visible if you look carefully. The 16 other weapons are distributed throughout my uniform and person in ways that make them essentially impossible to detect without a full strip search." Aiden's jaw tightened. "Wish they didn't do. Wish they didn't do." Rishal agreed. They turned a corner, and the academy barracks stretched ahead of them with doors spaced at regular intervals. Everything was clean and precisely arranged and designed to appear completely secure. The scanner at the entrance is calibrated for mass detection. If you know how to distribute weight properly and understand the resonance frequency of the scanning field, you can move through it without triggering an alert. "You're committing 17 violations of Academy protocol," Aiden said, and his voice dropped even lower. "Not including the fact that you apparently understood military-grade scanning technology well enough to circumvent it. 16 violations of Academy protocol," Rishal corrected. "The throwing stars in my hairpins are technically hair ornaments. That's just reasonable, personal grooming." Aiden stared at her. His exoskeleton would have been flashing different colors if he were crustacean. His gill fronds would have been flaring if he had them. Instead, he just had the expression of someone who was watching his friend commit elaborate acts of rule violation with the same casualty one might display while brushing teeth. "Why are you even here?" Aiden said finally. "You could be doing literally anything else with these skills. You could be working for a security firm. You could be a consultant. Instead, you're a cadet at a military academy where the primary rule you violated is the one rule you can't hide. Because I like it here," Rishal said simply. They arrived at her assigned quarters, and she pressed her hand against the lock panel. The door hissed this open with a satisfying hydraulic sound. And because this is actually interesting, Aiden followed her into the small barracks room with its minimal furnishings and single window. His usual optimistic energy seemed deflated by the sheer audacity of what she'd done. He watched her move into the space with that characteristic grace that made everything she did look effortless. "Inspector Sylvanus is going to notice," Aiden said. "He's thorough. He's literally a plant being that evolved consciousness through observation and patience. He's going to find something. Maybe," Rishal said, and started unpacking her limited personal items, or maybe not. Depends on whether he looks for weapons or just looks for violations of dormitory protocol. The academy barracks room was exactly what you'd expect from a military facility designed by aliens who understood function, but had very little use for aesthetics. The bed was efficient. The locker was secure. The desk was minimal. Rishal moved through the space, and by the time Aiden left, she appeared to be a completely standard cadet, settling into a completely standard room. She was not. Sylvanus arrived 30 minutes later with the kind of punctuality that suggested he understood time the same way most sentient beings understood basic physics. The plant being's living vine crown swayed gently as he entered the barracks room. His deep forest green eyes took in the space with an intensity that suggested he was cataloging not just what was there, but what should be there and what wasn't. His warm mahogany brown bark skin caught the light as he moved, and Rishal noticed that his body temperature was noticeably warmer when he stood near her, like standing near a sun that happened to be shaped like a person. Cadet Rishal, Sylvanus said, and his voice carried the kind of authority that made it clear he was accustomed to people listening to him. Standard Quarters Orientation. Your assignment is Section 7, Dormitory 3. These are your allocated spaces. He gestured with one long, elegant hand toward the locker and desk. Thank you, Inspector, Rishal said, and her posture shifted immediately into something slightly more formal. Respect. Deference. The kind of bearing that made it clear she understood hierarchy. I'm settling in well. The Academy is exceeding my expectations. Sylvanus's vine crown swayed slightly, and the small, deep green leaves caught the light. He was studying her in a way that made Rishal glad her weapons were distributed the way they were. Sylvanus didn't move like someone who was looking for weapons exactly. He moved like someone who was looking for things that didn't fit. He examined the locker. He checked the desk. He looked at how her uniform was arranged. He even noticed how she stood at a particular angle relative to the window. His earthy botanical scent shifted around him, like he was unconsciously expressing something that went beyond words. When he was calm, it smelled like fresh soil. When he was focused on something specific, it shifted toward green and photosynthetic. You served in residential security, Sylvanus said finally. Yes, Inspector. For 4 years before joining the Academy. Your background makes you unusual among Cadet Cohort 7. Sylvanus continued, and his vines settled into a gentle sway. Most cadets enter with basic training only. You enter with advanced weapons certification. The Academy values diversity of experience, Rishal said smoothly. Which was true and also completely avoided addressing anything important. Sylvanus's eye pupils dilated slightly, and the pale green tinted whites of his eyes made the expression more intense than it would have been on a human face. Something in the room had caught his attention. Some small detail that didn't fit the pattern. It was the knife blade in her right boot that had shifted slightly when she moved. Just enough that the reflection of light off the polished metal created a microglint that shouldn't have been there. Sylvanus's vine crown went rigid for a second. The vines straightened like they were pointing at something urgent, but then his pupils contracted slightly, and he looked at Rishal's face instead of the floor, and whatever he saw there made him reconsider. Academy protocol requires all weapons be stored in the armory, he said carefully. His voice maintained its calm authority. But something underneath it had shifted, like he just realized he was looking at something he didn't have complete information about yet. Yes, Inspector, I understand the protocol completely. Sylvanus turned and moved toward the door with that deliberate, organic grace that made his movements seem like they belonged to the space instead of intruding on it. His vines swayed as he walked, and the small leaves caught the light. Report to training grounds at 0800 hours for standard evaluation, he said. Your weapons certification will require verification. Of course, Inspector, Rishal said. I'll be ready. Sylvanus paused at the threshold. His vine crown trembled slightly, and the earthy scent around him shifted to something sharper, something more alert. But he didn't turn around. He simply left the barracks room with a departing nod that suggested he was filing something away in his botanical consciousness for later analysis. Rishal waited until his footsteps faded down the corridor before she allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The problem with military academies was that they had rules. And rules were wonderful things because they created patterns, and patterns could be understood, and understood patterns could be managed. The security scanning station had a scanning protocol that relied on mass and resonance. The barracks had dormitory protocols that focused on amenities and cleanliness. The training grounds would have evaluation protocols designed to test weapon proficiency and tactical knowledge. None of these protocols were actually designed to prevent someone who understood weapons management from carrying weapons. They were designed to prevent accidents. They were designed to prevent conflicts between cadets during the vulnerable early training period. They were designed to maintain order while people learned how to follow commands. Rishal understood commands. She understood hierarchy. She understood the purpose behind rules. She just believed that understanding the purpose behind a rule didn't obligate you to follow it if you had a better reason not to. The training grounds were everything an open area with natural lighting could be. Obstacle courses arranged with geometric precision. Climbing structures that suggested they'd been designed by someone who appreciated functionality over aesthetics. Practice dummies standing at regular intervals like silent sentinels monitoring the space. Rishal stretched her shoulders and felt the familiar weight distribution of her weapons settling more comfortably against her body. The throwing stars in her hairpins, the blade in her boot, the garrote in her collar, the knuckles in her boot heel. The sharpened edge folded into the seam of her uniform, the wire folded inside her sleeve, the small concussive device in her waistband, the throwing knives distributed across both sides of her torso, the lockpick set in her belt, the smoke pellets in her socks, the percussion cap in her wrist comm, and the remaining 3 weapons distributed in places that would require her to think about them, to remember where they were. 17 weapons. Sylvanus stood at the edge of the training grounds with a tablet, and his vine crown swaying with what Rishal was starting to recognize as his baseline state, relaxed, observant, waiting. His earthy botanical scent carried across the open air, weapons certification evaluation. Sylvanus said, and his deep green eyes fixed on Rishal with an intensity that suggested this might be the moment where everything changed. You will demonstrate proficiency with 3 standard academy weapons. We have pulse rifles and combat blades available. The 3rd category is optional selection. Understood, Inspector, Rishal said and walked toward the weapons rack with perfect posture. She selected a pulse rifle with practiced efficiency and checked the charge and ran through the basic safety protocol that she'd probably been doing since before she could read. The weapon felt familiar in her hands. Right, like an extension of her body that she understood better than most people understood their own limbs. The first target was 50 meters away, standard accuracy test. Rishal fired and the coherent energy pulse struck with precision. Dead center. The second target at 75 meters. Rishal adjusted for distance and fired and struck with the same dead center accuracy. The third target at 100 meters. Rishal breathed in and breathed out and fired and struck with the same dead center accuracy. Sylvanus' vine crown swayed slightly and his eyes narrowed. He made a note on his tablet. Something about those 3 shots had caught his attention in a different way than the earlier observation had. These weren't the shots of someone who'd received academy training. These were the shots of someone who'd practiced extensively, someone who understood weapons not as tools, but as extensions of themselves. Rishal selected a combat blade and ran through the standard forms. Footwork precise. Blade movement fluid, transition smooth, every motion exactly what Academy protocol would expect from someone with her stated background. Sylvanus watched and made more notes and said nothing. When Rishal returned to the weapons rack, she moved with the same confidence she'd displayed the entire time. She was about to set down the blade when a foot caught on a tuft of grass that shouldn't have been where it was. The kind of small imperfection in the training ground surface that happened because even military academies couldn't eliminate the chaos of nature. She stumbled, just slightly. Just enough that it disrupted her perfect balance for 1 second. Her hand came up to catch herself, and the combat blade twisted in her grip, and when she caught her footing again, the motion had revealed something. Something that glinted in the sunlight. A second blade. One that definitely wasn't part of Academy-issued equipment. One that was concealed in her sleeve and had briefly become visible during the stumble. Sylvanus's vine crown went completely rigid. Every single vine pointed upward in a posture that suggested his entire consciousness had just focused on one specific problem. His pupils dilated widely, and his earthy botanical scent shifted sharply to something more acrid and alert. Rishal's expression didn't change. She caught her footing. She steadied herself. She continued walking toward the weapons rack with complete composure, but something had shifted. Sylvanus knew. He didn't have proof yet. He didn't have certainty yet, but he knew that something was significantly wrong with Cadet Rishal, and now he was going to find everything. Sylvanus moved with deliberate precision toward the weapons rack. His vine crown remained rigidly upright, and his deep forest green eyes had shifted into something closer to investigative focus. The earthy botanical scent around him had sharpened to that acrid green photosynthetic smell that Rishal was beginning to understand meant he'd shifted into an entirely different mode of operation. That blade, Sylvanus said calmly, is not standard Academy issue. Rishal set down the combat blade she was holding and turned to face him with perfect composure. Her honey hazel eyes met his forest green ones without flinching. No, Inspector, it isn't. Sylvanus's vines trembled slightly. The direct admission had apparently disrupted whatever he'd been preparing to argue. He made a notation on his tablet with one long, elegant hand, while his other hand remained at his side. His warm mahogany brown bark skin seemed to radiate increased heat as if his body temperature had risen in response to the situation. Explain, he said simply. I have 17 weapons on my person, Rishal said, and her voice maintained the same calm that had carried her through the security scanning station earlier. I brought them into the Academy despite the disarm protocol. I distributed them across my uniform and person in ways designed to avoid detection, and I am comfortable with that choice. Sylvanus's eye pupils contracted sharply and then dilated again. His vine crown began to sway, but not in a relaxed way, in a way that suggested agitation at the cellular level. His earthy scent cycled between that sharp green and something darker. Something like soil turned over by something urgent. You understand that this constitutes violation of multiple Academy protocols, Sylvanus said carefully. Security breach, weapon smuggling, deception during intake screening. I understand completely, Inspector. And you maintain composure how? Sylvanus continued. His voice carried genuine curiosity underneath the authority. Most individuals would demonstrate elevated stress responses at this juncture. Rishal allowed a small smile to cross her face. Because I came to the Academy knowing exactly what would happen. I came here knowing that eventually someone would discover the weapons. The only question was when. Sylvanus lowered his tablet slowly. His vines settled into a gentle sway that suggested his consciousness was rapidly recalibrating something fundamental about his understanding of the situation. His pupils remained dilated, and his green-tinted eyes fixed on Rishal with the intensity of someone trying to solve a problem that had just become significantly more complicated. You wanted it to be discovered, he said, not a question. I wanted it to be discovered by the right person at the right time, Rishal corrected. The security station operated at base 9 efficiency. You operate at maximum observational capability. There's a difference. The ground beneath them suddenly trembled. Not earthquake, not an accident, a controlled vibration that suggested something was happening in the Academy's deeper systems. Something significant enough to register in the physical infrastructure. Both Rishal and Sylvanus turned toward the Academy complex. Lights flickered in the command center section. Alarms that had been silenced suddenly activated with a kind of urgency that suggested something had broken in the security systems in a way that couldn't be ignored. Kreks's voice erupted from the emergency comm system. All personnel to stations. Security breach in lower armory. Weapons crate 17 has been compromised. Sylvanus's vine crown went completely rigid again. His entire attention shifted from Rishal to the Academy complex, to the implications of a weapons crate being compromised during the exact moment he discovered her carrying 17 illicit weapons. His pupils dilated so widely they nearly consumed his entire eye structure. "Your weapons," he said slowly, "were a distraction." "My weapons were a backup plan," Rishal corrected. "The real problem is that the Academy's lower armory isn't actually secure. There's a third-party infiltration happening right now, and while security is focused on investigating my weapons, they're not focused on the actual threat." Sylvanus stared at her. His warm bark skin seemed to radiate heat like an engine that had just overcomplicated its own processing power. His vines drooped slightly as the implications settled into whatever passed for botanical consciousness in his species. "You brought 17 weapons into a secure facility deliberately to cause a distraction," he said finally. "I brought 17 weapons into a secure facility to prove that the disarm protocol was fundamentally broken," Rishal said calmly. "Then I demonstrated that even if the protocol worked perfectly, I could still get weapons past it through sheer competence. And now, while everyone is focused on my weapons, the actual infiltration team is moving through the lower armory unopposed." The emergency alarms intensified. Multiple sections of the Academy complex flickered with alert status. Rishal could see security personnel rushing through the corridors toward the command center. Could see the chaos that's resulted from a threat emerging from exactly where nobody expected it, while their attention was directed elsewhere. "You will come with me," Sylvanus said finally, not a request. His vines had begun to actively agitate, which appeared to be his version of serious concern. "And you will explain exactly what is happening." The command center was controlled chaos. Thalassa stood at one of the tactical displays with her gill fronds fully extended and flaring with each incoming report. Her bioluminescent shimmer was strobing rapidly, which appeared to be her equivalent of sustained panic. Her vertical pupils had dilated to maximum, and her scales seemed to shimmer with that electric turquoise that Rishal was starting to understand meant acute stress. Kreks sat at the security terminal, and his exoskeleton had cycled through approximately 7 different colors in the last 60 seconds. It was cycling between a deep burgundy that seemed close to black and a bright crimsons that suggested he was operating at maximum panic capacity. His mandibles were clicking so rapidly they created an almost continuous sound. His amber eyes glowed orange in their intensity. Aiden stood at the weapons display with his muscular frame rigid and his forest green eyes tracking the incoming reports with the kind of focus that suggested he was trying very hard not to have an emotional response to the situation. Weapons crate 17 in the lower armory. Kreks was saying to the security team through the comm system, someone accessed it using override codes. "We don't have override codes on file. This wasn't internal breach." Rishal walked into the command center with perfect posture, and Sylvanus following slightly behind her with his vine crown actively twitching. The movement created an immediate pause in the controlled chaos. Thalassa's gill fronds retracted slightly as she turned to face them. Her bioluminescence flickered from strobing panic to something closer to a search pattern. Her turquoise eyes focused on Rishal with an intensity that contained equal parts suspicion and something approaching respect. "Cadet Rishal," Thalassa said carefully, "you seem very calm for someone who just triggered a security protocol violation." "Because I triggered the security protocol violation intentionally," Rishal said simply, "to expose a different security breach that was happening simultaneously." Kreks's exoskeleton shifted to a confused mottled pattern that suggested his entire consciousness was having difficulty processing contradictory information. His mandibles stopped clicking. His amber eyes glowed uncertainly. "Explain," Sylvanus said, and gestured toward the tactical display. "Fully, with specifics." Rishal stepped forward and studied the display with the eye of someone who understood security systems at a fundamental level. Her trained gaze moved across the data patterns, and she pointed to a specific access point in the lower armory section. "Override codes weren't used," she said carefully. "Emergency maintenance access was used, which means someone on your maintenance staff either provided codes or was compromised. Weapons Crate 17 is standard munitions storage, but it's not what the infiltration team actually wanted. They wanted access to the secure containment section 3 levels below. That's where the experimental pulse array prototypes are stored." Kreks's exoskeleton went from confused mottled to bright alarmed red. His mandibles started clicking rapidly again, but this time it sounded like panic converted to action. "Pulse array prototypes," Kreks said and turned to his terminal. "We have 6 of those in containment. If those are removed, the Academy loses 40% of its advanced defense capacity, which is what the infiltration team is currently accomplishing." Rishal continued. "While you're all focused on investigating my weapons discovery, you're not focused on the lower levels. They'll have the prototypes removed and distributed before anyone can respond." Sylvanus's vine crown had stopped moving entirely. His entire body seemed to have shifted into a state of absolute stillness, which Rishal was beginning to understand was his version of maximum concentration. His earthy botanical scent had shifted again to something darker and more complex. "How do you know this?" Sylvanus asked quietly. "Because I've been studying the Academy's security infrastructure since I arrived 3 weeks ago," Rishal said. "The disarm protocol at intake wasn't about actual security. It was about maintaining the appearance of security. I brought 17 weapons because I needed to demonstrate that appearance of security is exactly why your actual security failed in the first place. If I can get weapons past your scanner, then external threats can get anything else they want past your other systems." Thalassa's gill fronds slowly extended back to normal range. Her bioluminescence shifted from strobing to a steady, thoughtful glow. Her vertical pupils contracted slightly as she processed what Rishal had just explained. "You committed protocol violations to prevent an actual breach," Thalassa said carefully, "by forcing us to acknowledge the foundational failure in our intake security. I committed protocol violations to make you pay attention to the right threat," Rishal corrected. "While everyone was focused on my weapons, the real problem moved into position. Now you can still respond, but you have to do it with knowledge of what you're actually defending." Kreks's exoskeleton had shifted to a very specific shade of burgundy that might have been respect filtered through residual stress. His mandibles moved more slowly now. His amber eyes had dimmed slightly, which suggested the immediate panic was transitioning to operational awareness. "Deploy response team to lower containment level 3, Kreks said to his security personnel. "Priority interception. Bring non-lethal restraints. We need prisoners, not permanent solutions." The response was immediate. Personnel moved with a kind of coordinated efficiencies that suggested military training actually worked when directed properly. The tactical display updated in real time as security teams moved to intercept the infiltration squad before they could escape with the pulse array prototypes. 5 minutes later, the first report came back. 6 individuals in maintenance uniforms moving toward the external exit with what appeared to be specialized containment cases. They'd be moving through the Academy's lowest levels with the kind of familiarity that suggested they'd had inside information. Security intercepted them at the main external airlock. No shots fired, no casualties. Just 6 individuals in restraints being processed by Kreks' security personnel, while the pulse array prototypes were carefully removed from the containment cases and returned to the secure facility. The crisis was resolved. Rishal stood in the command center and watched the resolution unfold with a kind of calm satisfaction that suggested she'd known exactly how this would resolve once she made her initial choice to bring 17 weapons into the Academy despite the disarm protocol. Sylvanus stepped beside her, and his vine crown had settled into a gentle sway that might have been his version of respect. His warm mahogany brown bark skin radiated heat, and his earthy botanical scent had shifted to something closer to fresh soil, something that suggested acceptance. "You will not face disciplinary action for protocol violations," Sylvanus said formally, "but you will report to my office at 0900 hours tomorrow. The Academy has a specific need for personnel who understand security systems at this level of sophistication." Rishal smiled. "What's the position?" "Director of Security Protocol Assessment," Sylvanus said. "You will test and verify all Academy security systems using whatever methods you deem necessary. Your 17 weapons were merely the beginning, apparently." Thalassa's gill fronds extended gently in what Rishal was beginning to understand was her version of a satisfied expression. Her bioluminescence had shifted to a warm, steady glow, and her turquoise eyes had regained their normal luminosity. Kreks' exoskeleton had settled into a comfortable burgundy rose, which appeared to be his version of relief mixed with administrative satisfaction. His mandibles moved slowly, as if he was already thinking about how to restructure his security protocols based on what he'd learned. Aiden stepped forward, and his forest green eyes contained something that looked like pride mixed with the certainty that Rishal had just made his life significantly more complicated going forward. 17 weapons, he said simply. 16 weapons and reasonable personal grooming, Rishal corrected. The hairpins technically count as accessories. Aiden laughed, and the sound seemed to break the remaining tension in the command center. Around them, the Academy began to shift from crisis response back to operational status. The infiltration team was secured. The threat was neutralized. The protocols that had failed had been identified. And one human cadet with 17 weapons had just accidentally become the most important security consultant the Academy had ever had.